Picture this, a quiet evening in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. Expensive homes, manicured lawns, a perfect idyll. But suddenly, a police siren breaks the silence. A black teenager is standing outside his house when a patrol car suddenly pulls up in front of him. The officer steps out with wariness in his eyes. He doesn't see a teenager, he sees a threat. Hands on the hood. There is no resistance, only confusion. Why? But what this officer doesn't know is, this guy is the nephew of the governor himself. The situation is getting worse. The tension is growing. What do you think will happen next? While you're immersed in this story, please leave a comment below with your name and where you're watching this video from. We appreciate each and every one of you. You're the ones who help our channel grow and reach new heights. Without you, we wouldn't be able to tell these important stories, and your participation means everything to us. Thank you for being with us. You are our support, and it is thanks to you that we continue to move forward. The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, filling the sky with soft shades of pink and gold. Silence reigned in one of the most prestigious areas of the city. Manicured lawns and neatly trimmed trees created an atmosphere of calm and well-being. The roads were almost empty. Only luxury cars drove by from time to time, reflecting the wealth of their owners. Michael, a 19-year-old black boy, was strolling through the area, enjoying the warmth of the evening. He loved coming here to spend time with his uncle, who lived in one of the magnificent houses. The soft wind blew through his hair, and he felt free, immersed in a carefree atmosphere. Suddenly, his calm was shattered by the shrill sound of a police car's horn. Michael looked down the street and saw the patrol car swerve toward the curb. His heart pounded as an officer stepped out, his expression wary. The slight worry suddenly turned to icy fear. No one in this neighborhood was used to seeing police, much less on a night like this. "What's going on?" he thought as the policeman, without waiting for questions, quickly approached him. The officer, in uniform with a rough expression, looked at Michael carefully, and the teenager had a premonition that something was wrong. "What are you doing here?" the officer said sharply, without even introducing himself. As if it were natural, he began to raise his voice. Michael felt cold sweat break out on his forehead. He tried to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. "I'm just going to see my uncle," he said, but the officer didn't seem to be listening. Instead, he continued to stare at Michael as if he were the main threat to this perfect neighborhood. Silence fell over the evening once more, but now it was filled with tension, anticipation, fear. Neighbors began to peer out of their windows, whispering and watching the scenes unfolding before their eyes. To them, this was just another suspicious incident, nothing more. To Michael, it was the beginning of his worst nightmare. The policeman stood before Michael like a mountain, unyielding and threatening. His cold gaze said more than words. The officer leaned toward Michael, his face coming closer, full of disdain and distrust. "What are you doing here, black boy? You don't belong here," he said with obvious sarcasm. The words burned Michael, leaving him with a sense of humiliation he couldn't express. His body tensed with fear, but he tried to remain calm. "I'm just going to my uncle's. He lives here," he repeated, but the officer only scoffed, ignoring his words as if they didn't matter. "Don't make me laugh. You thought you were just another street thug who decided to come and visit our ranks?" The policeman continued, turning his attention to Michael as if he were a criminal, despite the fact that he looked completely harmless. The eyes of the officer's fellow officers watched the scene from afar, encouraging him with their silence. Each of them knew that in this area, blacks like Michael were always considered suspicious. Michael felt his throat go dry with shame and fear. His feet were rooted to the ground, unable to move, even when the officer came closer and ordered him to raise his hands. "Put your hands on the hood," he commanded, and the teenager obediently obeyed, unable to understand how it had happened. He wanted to protest, to scream his innocence, but emotion, cut off from speech, immobilized him. The officer looked down on him and searched his pockets, but he was not shy about hurling insults. "How did you get in here? Ha! Probably nicked this from some poor bastard. You don't even deserve to breathe in this neighborhood." Michael didn't know what to say. His world had been turned upside down, and he found himself in a situation where his dignity as a human being was being called into question. As the officer continued his search, neighbors began peering out of their windows, their expressions filled with curiosity and disdain. In their eyes, Michael was not a boy, but a representative of all of them, those who had no right to be among them. The whispers and murmurs only added to his sense of isolation and humiliation. Finally, the officer, pleased with his actions, laughed. "We'll see what your uncle says when he finds out you're hanging around here. I think he, too, should be taught that people like you should stay away from this place." There was contempt in his voice, but in his eyes, there was confidence that he was right. Michael felt his heart sink. He hadn't just been detained, he had been humiliated, made a laughingstock. He couldn't believe his life had come down to this moment. All his dreams and hopes for the future were crumbling before his eyes, and with them his sense of justice. "This is wrong," he whispered to himself, trying to find the strength to fight what was happening, but his voice seemed to vanish into thin air, unheard. At that moment, he realized that in the eyes of this officer and many others, he would forever remain simply a suspect figure, and it seemed that his racial identity would forever determine his fate. Michael stood with his hands up, his heart pounding in his chest as if it wanted to burst out. He didn't understand how his life could change so abruptly, just because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The officer continued to insult him, and every word he said burned like hot metal. "Aren't you ashamed, kid? Walking around our streets like you have a right to?" The cop growled, his voice dripping with contempt. "There are only normal people here, and you're just another stupid teenager who decided to walk around expensive houses. Do you really think we don't know who you are?" Michael swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel his neighbors looking at him, some of whom nodded approvingly at the officer, as if this order was entirely justified. He wanted to scream, "I'm not a criminal, I'm innocent," but the words wouldn't come out, and all he could do was stand there and endure the humiliation. The officer, seeing that Michael was unresponsive, decided to show him who was boss. He stepped closer, grabbed the teenager roughly by the wrist, and, holding him so tightly that he almost lost his balance, continued, "Listen, you shouldn't even be here. You're not welcome here. Yeah, your life is worthless in this neighborhood, kid, and you know it." The other police officers, watching this, began to laugh. One of them said with a smirk, "That kid must have just crawled out of some ghetto. How did he even get here?" This caused even more laughter, and although Michael did not know what to say, his anger and humiliation grew like waves approaching the shore. "He's just a toy in someone's hands. You know?" the officer continued, pointing at Michael as if he were an object of ridicule. "How many of you have there been? How many times have we seen them come here, trying to get into our world?" He had a cruel, predatory look in his eyes, and that feeling of helplessness filled Michael's heart again. Just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, the officers suddenly pushed him toward the car, pinning him against the hood. "You don't seem to understand that you have to be held accountable for your actions," he said, and in that moment, everyone around him saw the cruelty and bias of the law on full display. Michael felt his pride and self-esteem crumble before the eyes of the public. He was just a teenager, but now he was the target of ridicule and condemnation. The faces of passers-by did not evoke sympathy, only cold indifference and prejudice. Every movement they made emphasized his position as a victim. By this time, the police officer's insults had reached their peak. "You think that because your uncle is the governor, you can get away with this? That you can walk around here like everyone owes you something?" the officer asked defiantly. There was hatred in his eyes, and it was a feeling Michael had never experienced before. He didn't know how to respond, because his life experience hadn't prepared him for moments like this. All the while, Michael thought about how his uncle, the governor, always spoke of justice and equality, how he stood up for human rights and condemned racism. Now, when he was in such a humiliating situation, those words seemed like empty words. How could someone who stood up for justice so much be associated with a world where his nephew was subjected to such insults and ridicule? As the policeman continued to harass him, Michael felt his anger begin to turn into despair. Why? Why do they hate me so much? How can I change anything when everyone around me is so against me? These thoughts were his only consolation that night. But suddenly he had a plan. He could try calling his uncle, explaining what was going on, and maybe this would all be over. But as he picked up the phone, the policeman saw the movement. "Don't you dare do that," he shouted, grabbing the phone and throwing it on the ground. "You think you have privileges? You're nothing." With every word he spoke, with every smirk he gave, Michael felt his soul being torn apart. The unfairness of this moment was unbearable. He, a boy who had never harmed anyone, was trapped by prejudice and hatred, and in that moment, he knew his fight for justice was just beginning. Things weren't going to get any easier, but he vowed to himself that he wouldn't let this incident ruin his life. After all, he wasn't just a victim, he was part of something bigger than himself. With that decision in mind, He prepared to fight the system that had treated him so cruelly. Michael stood pressed against the cold metal of the car, his heart pounding in humiliation and rage. The officer, oblivious to his dismay, continued to act as if he was in complete control, as if his actions were entirely justified. "Do you know what you're doing here?" the cop asked again, leaning closer, narrowing his eyes to get a better look at the teenager. "You must have no idea what polite society looks like." Michael, feeling helpless, clenched his teeth and remained silent. His pride did not allow him to respond to the derogatory words, although anger and resentment were seething inside him like a volcano ready to erupt. But every time he tried to collect his thoughts, despair overwhelmed him, and he realized that every word he said could only make the situation worse. In front of everyone, these people looked at him as if he were a criminal, without even knowing his name. "Look, I have a job to do, and I'm not going to waste my time on the likes of you," the officer said, pulling away and taking a step back. He slowly pulled the handcuffs out of his pocket, and the movement was like a punch to Michael's heart. He couldn't believe he was going to be arrested for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "What? You're going to arrest me? For what? I didn't do anything," he cried, panic in his voice. He tried to look at the officer, hoping that he might show some humanity, but instead he saw only inflexibility and indifference. The officer just laughed. "That's right, you didn't do anything, and that's why you're here now, because you're black and you're not supposed to be walking these streets. You just know that you have the privilege of being privileged, but that doesn't mean you can act like a king." As if the words were a blow, Michael felt his soul being crushed. The misunderstanding and hatred that emanated from the officer was so palpable that it felt like it could be cut with a knife. He lacked the words to explain that he was not just a black kid, but someone who dreamed of a future, who wanted to change the world, who was not going to put up with prejudice, but it was useless. Michael thought about his family, how his uncle had always fought for justice, always talked about equality. Thinking about them gave him strength, but standing here under the bright lights of the police cars, he felt it all slipping away from him. How could he explain that his uncle was the governor, and that he didn't deserve to be treated like this? "Ready for this?" the officer said, slapping the cuffs on Michael's wrists as if it were a routine matter. With each passing second the metal bound his hands. Michael felt his pride crumble. The officer gave him a dismissive look, as if to say that no amount of privilege would save him from the consequences. "Why are you doing this?" he asked with difficulty, desperation evident in his voice. The officer just rolled his eyes, as if he had heard these words 1,000 times, and replied with arrogance, "You still don't understand what's happening right now? You are a threat to our community. In this neighborhood, people like you have no room for error." Now all eyes were on them. Neighbors continued to watch from their windows, some filming the scene on their phones, others simply exchanging disapproving glances. Every time Michael looked up, he saw mocking faces. He felt like this crowd was turning him into a target, like he was a sign of something bad, something that needed to be eliminated. "You think something's wrong with you?" one of the officers standing nearby commented, pointing at Michael. His voice was full of contempt, and his eyes were shining with excitement. "I think you're about to learn a lesson for life. Think about that the next time you decide to walk around our neighborhoods." Michael didn't know how to respond. He was completely confused, not understanding how things could have gotten this far. But at that moment, he felt the anger inside him growing, as if it was gaining strength. "This is wrong," he exclaimed, although there was no confidence in his voice. "I'm not a criminal. I just want to see my uncle." But these words only spurred the officer, who responded by roughly pushing him toward the car. "Stop resisting. It's only making your life harder," he said, laughing, as the surrounding officers began to laugh at how Michael had gotten himself into this situation. Each laugh sounded like another blow to his dignity. As he was thrown into the back of the police car, Michael looked out the window, trying to hold back his tears. He didn't understand how his life had changed so abruptly. It wasn't just humiliation, it was pure torture, where every moment, every taunt, every look turned him into a victim. His soul was full of pain, and he felt this injustice squeezing him, leaving only a feeling of hopelessness. At that moment, he remembered his uncle's words. "We live in a world where justice and equality are still a dream, but we must fight for it." He understood that now, even if everything seemed hopeless, he must find the strength to continue this fight. As the officer closed the car door, Michael heard the keys jingling in his pocket. He knew this wasn't the end, but just the beginning. He was ready to fight, no matter how tough the confrontation would be. But first, he had to get out of here alive, with his body intact, dignity, ready to tell their story and fight for those who cannot. A fire lit inside him. He would no longer remain silent. The incident became a turning point, a moment when he realized he had to challenge the systemic injustices that many black teenagers face and, perhaps, one day, change those systems. It took Michael several minutes to realize that his arrest was not just an event, but a symbol of what many black teenagers faced on a daily basis. Sitting in the back of the police car, he felt his hands still cuffed, and the metal became a symbol of injustice for him. He watched the world outside the window continue to spin, as people went about their business, leaving only him in this eerie vacuum. The looks of people passing by ranged from interest to complete disregard. It seemed as if to them he was just another criminal. The officer in the front seat continued to mutter under his breath, his words sounding like curses, and he didn't seem to be showing an ounce of sympathy. Every movement, every sentence was full of contempt. Michael knew that his life was different now, and this feeling was gradually growing into a clear understanding. Suddenly he thought of his friends who, like him, might be in a similar situation. They were all in the same boat, in a society where the color of their skin determined their future. It was like an endless cycle that was hard to escape unless you fought. Suddenly, a thought flashed through Michael's mind. I have to tell my story. I have to be a voice for all those who feel invisible. At that moment, he had a new desire. He wanted his uncle, the governor, to know what had happened and do something about it. He began to imagine how he would speak out about his arrest, how he would fight a system that devalued black people and their rights. He didn't just want to get out of this machine, he wanted to change the society that created such bias. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the silence. It was the officer's cell phone ringing. Michael turned his head and watched as the officer lifted the receiver and leaned over to speak. The conversation was brief, but Michael caught a few phrases that cut through him like a sharp knife. "Yeah, we got him. No, nothing serious. Just another black guy who doesn't know his place." Every word seemed to echo his own fears and humiliations. He realized that to the officer, he was not a person, but simply a problem that needed to be solved. This conversation opened Michael's eyes to the true nature of the system. He began to understand that this problem was not limited to his personal experience. It was something much bigger. When the conversation was over, the officer hung up the phone and turned around and said with a grin, "Okay, kid, we got something for you. If you think your uncle is going to do anything about this, you're seriously mistaken." With that, he got out of the car, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. Every second of silence weighed on him. He began to think about his family, how his mother had always taught him to stand up for truth and justice. In that moment, he realized that he had to fight not only for himself, but for everyone who could not speak. He began to visualize himself telling his story, walking up to the podium and letting his voice ring out at full volume. Suddenly the car door opened and another policeman, younger than the previous one, looked inside. "Hey, man," he said, his tone a little softer, but still full of displeasure. "It's time. You need to get out." Michael stepped out of the car and was seen by a small world, a group of spectators, a few policemen who were watching the situation with curiosity and indifference. As he was led to the police station, a melody of hope played in Michael's head. He knew his uncle would not ignore this. He was ready to tell him what had happened and make sure it never happened again. But as soon as they entered the station, the air around him grew heavy. He could feel the other police officers looking at him, cold and contemptuous. And again the thought of how many people like him were going through this flashed through his mind. Whispers and taunts floated around him, and he felt a wave of humiliation wash over him again. But now he knew, he was not alone. His detention might be his problem, but it could also be the beginning of something more significant, the beginning of a fight for change. With that feeling, he raised his head, and a spark of determination lit up his eyes. From that moment on, he was no longer just a victim, he was a fighter for justice. By the time his uncle learned what had happened, he was ready to tell his story, ready to raise his voice for those who could not, ready to fight for a world where the color of one's skin would not determine one's fate, and where everyone had a right to justice. When Michael walked into the police station, the air was thick with tension. The sounds of handcuffs clanking against metal mingled with the muffled conversations of the officers. He could feel eyes on him from all sides. It wasn't just humiliation, it was a physical sensation of pressure, as if the entire room was closing in on him. The officers talked among themselves, pointing and laughing. Each laugh made Michael angry. He realized he couldn't let this humiliation go unanswered. He wanted to scream, to tell them who he really was, but instead he remained silent, gathering his strength and resolve. He was led into a small office where the senior officer stood. He was a large, stocky man with a serious expression. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at Michael with disdain. "Well, little one," he said, using a derogatory nickname, as if he were treating him like a toy rather than a person. "Do you know why you're here?" Michael felt a storm of emotion building inside him. "I'm not a criminal," he said quietly, trying to contain his anger. "I was just passing through." The officer just laughed. "Oh yeah? Just passing by? In this neighborhood? Why would you be here if you weren't up to no good? You know this is no place for someone like you." His words were full of contempt and displeasure, and Michael felt the blood pounding in his temples. "It's not fair," he said, trying to remain calm. "It's not my fault that I'm black. You just look at me and see the color of my skin and not the person I am." The senior officer just rolled his eyes, indicating he wasn't going to listen. "You know, kid, we're not here to pick your brains. You're a problem, and you need to learn to understand that. We're the law, and if we say you're a suspect, then you are." Every word he said cut like a knife. Michael felt himself on the edge. A plan was spinning in his head. He had to talk to his uncle, but how could he convey to him all the pain and humiliation he was experiencing? At that moment, the office door opened and another officer approached them. He had a serious, focused moment, and leaned over to whisper something in the senior officer's ear. Michael couldn't make out the words, but he saw the senior officer's expression reflect surprise. "What? The governor? His nephew?" the senior officer said, his tone changing. Michael felt a tiny spark of hope slip into his heart. "What are you saying?" he asked again, but now with obvious concern. The senior officer seemed to consider this, and then turned reluctantly to Michael. "You say you're the governor's nephew?" he asked incredulously, as if he still didn't believe such a coincidence was possible. "Yes," Michael said, trying to sound confident. "My uncle is the governor. I never thought I'd be detained just because I'm black, but you have no right to treat me like this." Now that he had said those words, he felt a confidence welling up inside him. He knew he had to use this situation to show how rotten the system could be. He had to prove that there was no excuse for this attitude. The senior officer seemed to realize that the situation might get out of hand. He turned to another officer. "Tell him to call his uncle. If this is true, we can resolve this peacefully." The officer left the office, and Michael was left alone with the pain and helplessness. He didn't know how his uncle would react to this news. How would he tell him what had happened? He thought of his uncle, who always talked about fairness and the need to fight bias. "If Uncle comes, he will help me," he thought, but at the same time, an inner voice was worrying him. What if Uncle decides that this is not worth his time? What if he only sees this negative side and feels ashamed that his nephew got into this situation? He felt his fears growing, and he began to dream again about the future he wanted to build. He remembered how he had dreamed of becoming a lawyer, how he wanted to change the system from the inside, but now he couldn't think about the future when his real rights were at stake. The door opened again and the same officer who had left came back to him, holding a phone in his hand. "You need to talk to your uncle," he said, handing Michael the phone. Michael picked up the phone and his heart started beating faster. He knew this was the moment that would change his life. He dialed the number and a moment later a familiar voice rang out. "Michael, is that you?" the uncle asked, his voice filled with worry and concern. "Yes, Uncle, it's me," Michael said, trying to sound confident. "I'm here at the station. I was detained." He felt his breath catch. With each passing second, he realized that this might be his chance to bring the truth about what was happening in society. He told his uncle about the arrest, how the police looked at him like a criminal, and how painful and humiliating it was for him to be in this situation. "Michael, I'm listening," the uncle said, his voice full of seriousness. "I'll be there right away. You're not alone, and I'll do everything I can to sort this situation out." Michael felt hope rise in his heart. He knew his uncle would not ignore this matter. He knew there would be hard times ahead, but now he felt confidence returning. The officers began to mutter among themselves, and the atmosphere in the room changed. They looked at him differently now. He wasn't just a black kid. He was the governor's nephew, and that gave him strength. Michael decided he would fight for himself and for everyone who faced prejudice. He knew this was just the beginning, but he was preparing for what was to come. His uncle was visiting, and this meeting could be the turning point that would help him not only free himself, but change the world around him. When Michael looked into the eyes of the senior officer, he knew he would not allow his life to be defined by the color of his skin. He would fight for what was right, and he would not stop until he achieved his goal. The sound of footsteps approaching the police station was as loud as a heartbeat. When the door opened and the governor entered the office, all eyes that had been on Michael instantly switched to him. The officers froze, and the air was filled not only with tension, but also with anxious anticipation. The governor was a tall, stately man, dressed in a formal suit. He looked confident, but there was concern in his eyes. "Where is my nephew?" the governor asked, his voice loud and clear. He was not going to waste time on small talk. "He's here, sir," the senior officer said, trying to maintain his dignity, although it was now clear that this situation was getting out of control. The governor stepped toward the table and looked at Michael, who was still handcuffed and sitting in the chair. At that moment, all the feelings of humiliation and fear came crashing down on him again with renewed force. He looked at his uncle, and his eyes reflected hope and fear. "Michael, it's going to be okay," the governor said, his voice softening. He came closer and leaned down, beginning to uncuff the handcuffs. "You shouldn't have to go through this. We'll figure it out." As the handcuffs fell to the floor, Michael felt his breathing suddenly become easier. He stood up and hugged his uncle, unable to hold back the tears. They were tears of relief, anger, and pain. "Why is this happening? Uncle, why are they treating me like this just because of the color of my skin?" The governor straightened up, his expression serious. "This is something we deal with every day. I know how hard it is to be a black man in this country. This is not just an individual problem. It's a systemic problem, and we have to fight it together." The senior officer, watching the scene, quickly glanced at the other officers, who were beginning to whisper among themselves. He knew the situation was getting heated. "Sir, I know this may look bad, but we were just doing our job. This area has a crime problem, and we can't ignore appearances," he said, his voice shaking with self-justification. The governor looked at him with displeasure. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to discriminate. You must understand that this approach only makes the problems worse. You cannot judge a person by the color of his skin. It is simply unacceptable." Michael noticed the officers start to look uneasy. There was a flicker of recognition in their eyes that their actions could have serious consequences. He felt a little stronger, as if his uncle was standing behind him, and that gave him confidence. The governor turned to Michael and continued, "I want you to know that I have your back. We will do everything in our power to prevent this from happening again. I will take this on at the state level." Michael looked at his uncle and felt that perhaps his story could be a catalyst for change. He thought of his friends, of other teenagers who did not have such privileges. "But what can we do, Uncle? How can we help others if they do not have a voice?" he asked, feeling a new desire begin to form in his heart. The governor put his hand on his nephew's shoulder and replied, "First, we need to get to the bottom of what happened here. I will insist on a formal investigation to find out why it happened and who was responsible, but we also need to start a conversation about how we can change public opinion and remove bias from policing." The senior officer became nervous when the governor brought up the investigation. "Sir, do you realize this could have serious implications for our department?" he said, trying to defend himself. The governor looked at him coldly. "It's not me. It's you who must understand what the consequences will be if this continues. You must act. This isn't just a question of Michael. This is a question of how you treat the people who serve you." Michael felt a fire of determination burning inside him. He had always wanted his voice to be heard, but now it was more important than ever. "Uncle, I want to do something. I don't want this to happen to anyone else again," he said, determined. The governor nodded. "And that's right. We can start a campaign to raise awareness about racism and bias. You can tell your story to show that it needs to be addressed, and we can create a platform for others to share their stories." Every word his uncle said gave Michael confidence. He imagined how together they could change the situation, how they could unite people and give them a chance to be heard. But at that moment the senior officer, exchanging glances with the other policeman, said, "But how can we be sure that this is not just an accident? Maybe he really was planning something?" These words brought out the anger in Michael again. "That's the problem. You always assume that black kids are to blame without even knowing their history. You don't know who I am or what I do," he responded without holding back. The governor raised his hand, calling for silence. "Let's not make the same mistake again. We have to find solutions, not blame each other. This is a public issue, and we have to fight it together." Michael looked at his uncle, and a desire flared inside him. "I want to talk about this. I want others to know that we are not alone, that there is hope for change. We're all here for this," the governor said. He turned to the officers. "I expect your full support in this. We'll start by reviewing your training and increasing diversity in the department. This isn't just a race issue, it's a fairness issue." The senior officer looked at the governor with uncertainty. "But this may cause discontent among some members of our department," he said, trying to find an excuse. "I'm not concerned about the discontent. I'm concerned about what's happening to our people. That's important. We're in the 21st century, and those kinds of prejudices have to go," the governor said with determination. Michael felt his heart fill with hope. Maybe they could really make a difference. Maybe this could be the start of a movement that would bring racism to the surface, and people who were experiencing the same pain would be heard. The governor turned back to Michael and said, "You'll be able to go to the press conference and tell your story. This is an important step in combating bias." Michael nodded. He knew this might be a difficult step, but he was ready to speak up for those who couldn't, ready to fight for change. Soon they were outside the office, and the air outside the station walls was not so heavy. The sun was shining overhead, and the world seemed a little brighter. Michael felt new powers awakening within him, as if his story was just beginning. He was ready to take responsibility and fight for what he believed in. This meeting with his uncle changed him, and now he was determined to do everything he could to give people hope and change their lives. There were difficulties ahead, but he knew he was not alone, and that was the most important thing. The day after the police station incident, the atmosphere in the governor's office was tense. Michael came to prepare for an upcoming press conference. His uncle, the governor, had assembled a team of communications experts, human rights advocates, and psychologists to help him formulate the thoughts and emotions Michael was about to express. The lights in the office were on, creating a warm glow, but the people's faces showed their concern. The governor looked focused. He knew this event could be a turning point in the fight against racism in their state, and he wanted it to go perfectly. "Michael, I know you're upset. That's normal," the governor said, patting him on the shoulder, "but your voice is what we need. You need to share your story so others can understand what's really going on." Michael sat at his desk, his hands shaking as he looked at the group of people gathered around him. They were all successful, confident, and competent, but he felt out of place. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, rubbing his forehead. "I'm just a teenager. Who am I to say that?" One of the advocates, a woman named Laura, smiled at him and said, "You are the one who should be talking about this. You are living history. You are the voice of a generation that is facing prejudice and racism. Your story is important." Michael looked at her. He knew he had the power to change something, but fear still gripped him. He didn't want to be ridiculed or misunderstood, but at the same time, he knew that many people faced this. He couldn't remain indifferent. "Okay," he finally said, collecting his thoughts. "I'll try." At that moment, he felt a spark of confidence ignite inside him. The team began discussing key points to be made at the press conference. The governor spoke about his personal struggles with racism, how he'd seen his friends and family suffer from bias, and the importance of talking about these issues openly. "We have to call for action," he said, "and we have to do it together." They discussed the importance of highlighting the issues that Black teens face and how their stories often go unreported. Laura shared statistics about how many Black people are arrested without probable cause and how these cases impact families and communities. "These aren't just numbers, these are lives," she said to Michael. "Your story is part of those lives. When you tell it, you give people a chance to hear it and understand it." The meeting went on for hours. Each participant added their own ideas and suggestions, trying to make the message as strong and convincing as possible. But Michael was still nervous. Finally, he decided to ask the most important question. "What if they don't understand? What if I'm wrong?" "Then we'll be here to support you," Laura replied. "It's not just what you say that's important, it's how you feel. People will be able to tell if you're being sincere and if your message is sincere." These words gave him strength. He understood that even if he couldn't express his thoughts perfectly, it was important to be himself. This was his story, his life, and no one could take that away from him. The next morning Michael woke up with a heavy heart. The worry was still there. He looked in the mirror and told himself that he had to be brave. He put on his best clothes, tried to look confident, although inside he was still unsure. When he and the governor arrived at the press conference, the atmosphere was tense. Reporters, cameras, and microphones surrounded them. The governor walked confidently onto the stage, followed by Michael. Feeling the eyes of thousands on him, he realized that this moment was not just about him, but about everyone who had ever experienced bias and injustice. The governor began with opening remarks about why they were there and what had happened to Michael. He spoke about the importance of fairness and equality, and then handed the floor over to his nephew. Michael stepped forward, his heart pounding like never before. He looked around and saw faces full of anticipation. Finally, he gathered his courage and said, "I'm standing here today to tell my story. I want you all to know that this happened to me only because of who I am. I'm a black teenager, and that made me a target for bias." It was like a bolt from the blue. He felt a fire burning inside him. "Yesterday I was detained only because the officers did not see me as a human being. They only saw the color of my skin and decided that I was a criminal. This is wrong, and I am here to say that we must not allow this to happen." His voice was confident, and he felt his words beginning to resonate in people's hearts. The journalists, who had been focused on their notes at first, were now looking at him with attention. "I want everyone to know that bias exists and it hurts. Every time I leave my house, I feel fear. Fear that I will not be understood. Fear that I may become another victim of injustice." Tears welled up in his eyes as he continued. "We have to fight this problem. We can't sit back and watch others suffer. Let's work together to make the world a better place. Let's make sure everyone's voice is heard." Michael felt his words touch hearts. He saw some of those present fan themselves with handkerchiefs. This gave him strength. He thought of his friends, of all those who had faced similar injustice. As he finished his speech, he noticed the room fill with applause. It wasn't just a sound, it was an explosion of support and hope. He glanced at the governor, who nodded proudly, knowing that his nephew had not only done it, but inspired so many. The governor came up to him and hugged him, and in that moment Michael knew he was not alone. He was part of a movement, part of a change that needed to happen. His story was just the beginning, and he was ready to fight for his truth and the truth of others. At that moment, he promised himself that he would keep speaking out, keep fighting, and keep helping others. He now knew that his voice mattered, and he was going to use it to its fullest potential. In the days since the press conference, the public has been buzzing about Michael's experiences. News of his arrest and courageous speech has spread quickly across the United States, and his story has quickly become part of a larger conversation about racism and bias in law enforcement. Every morning, Michael wakes up, opens his phone, and sees his name and photo appearing in articles and on news channels. But with the excitement comes some unpleasant consequences. Online comments are both supportive and critical. One day, while browsing social media, he came across a post that shocked him. Some users openly said that he was simply playing the race card, while others claimed that he was drawing unnecessary attention to himself. It reminded him that even when he was trying to raise important issues, hatred and bias still existed. That day, after school, he went to the center, where he was working with human rights activists. The governor proposed an open meeting, inviting local activists, teenagers, and parents to discuss ways to combat racism and improve the law enforcement system. When Michael walked into the room, he saw familiar faces. People who had also experienced bias had gathered to share their stories and experiences. It felt like the support he was looking for, but also like a burden, as he knew their stories were filled with pain and fear. Laura, one of the leading activists, opened the meeting. "Friends, we are not only here to talk about what happened, but also to act. We have the power to change something, and Michael is our example, but we must unite and support each other." Michael stood up and began to speak about his experience. "I never thought I would be part of this conversation. I just wanted to live my life, but instead I found myself in the spotlight. I'm here to say that we have to fight for our rights and for our friends who can't speak up." The room filled with applause, but at that moment he noticed the worry on some people's faces. After his speech, several teenagers stood up and began telling their stories. Each of them shared moments of humiliation and fear when they were judged simply by their appearance. One guy named Kevin, who was in high school, started talking about how he was pulled over while walking home with friends. "We were just walking down the street, laughing and talking, and then the cops pulled up. They asked us what we were doing there, like we had no right to be in that area. I felt like I was trapped and I couldn't get out. Michael felt his heart sink. He knew he wasn't alone in his feelings. It was reassuring, but also scary. Kevin continued, I told them I was just going home, but they didn't listen. They started checking our pockets, and I felt like I was being humiliated. They didn't see us as kids just hanging out. They saw criminals. Michael met Kevin's gaze and there was an understanding between them. They both knew what it was like to be judged for your appearance. Next up was a girl named Tiffany. She spoke about being called names in the schoolyard as a child and how it left a deep mark on her. I never felt like I was good enough. Every time someone looked at me, I thought they were only seeing the color of my skin. It was so hard, she said, holding back tears. The people in the room listened intently, and Michael realized that this was more than just a gathering. It was a platform for healing, understanding, and support. He saw some of the participants begin to hug, exchanging words of encouragement. After a few stories, Laura raised her hand to get attention. We're all here to support each other, but we also need to think about what we can do to make a difference. How can we get the authorities' attention and make them act? One activist, Robert, suggested an awareness campaign. We can organize peaceful protests, collect signatures and appeal to local authorities. But it is important that we are united in this. We must show that there are many of us and we will not remain silent. Michael felt energized. This was what he needed, a chance to act, a chance to make a difference. I want to be part of this campaign, he said, raising his voice. I want people to know that we are not alone, and we are not going to take this anymore. The room filled with applause again. Michael's words rang with conviction and passion. He understood that he was no longer just a victim, he was part of a movement. Following the discussion, a meeting was scheduled for the following week to begin organizing the campaign. Michael returned home feeling that not only his voice, but the voices of everyone present had become important. They were ready to unite and fight bias and racism. The next day, Michael returned to school with a new sense of purpose. He knew it would be a tough road, but he was ready. He had friends who supported him, and he knew this was more than just his story. It was the story of everyone who had ever experienced racism. In class, he heard his classmates discussing his speech. Some talked about how brave it was, while others wondered if racism still existed in their community. It reminded him that they all needed to keep talking about it. That night, he sat down to write an article for the school newspaper. He wanted everyone to know about bias and what had happened to him. He wrote about his feelings, his fear, and how he had finally found his voice. He ended the article by saying that change was possible if they all came together and fought for justice. The next morning, when he got to school, his article had already been published. He felt a surge of pride when his classmates came up and started talking about it. Michael, this is really cool. I didn't even know this was happening, one of his friends said, nodding in understanding. From that moment on, he realized that his words had power. This was his opportunity to inspire others, to raise their voices. He was ready to continue the fight to show that racism had no place in their society, and that every person deserved respect, regardless of the color of their skin. The chapter ended with Michael looking to the future with hope. He knew there was a lot of work ahead, but he was ready. He was ready to be the voice of change. As the day of the planned campaign approached, Michael felt excitement and fear merging in his heart. Every time he imagined himself on stage, speaking in front of many people, the desire to change the world ignited within him. He knew that this day would be an important milestone in his life and in the lives of many others who had experienced prejudice and racism. But at the same time, he felt the pressure mounting. Michael worked with a group of activists to create slogans, posters, and materials to distribute. Every evening they met at the local library to discuss the details of the upcoming campaign. Laura enthusiastically inspired everyone. This is not just our protest. This is an opportunity to make our voices heard. We must show that we are united. Michael felt the inspiration from Laura and the other participants helping him to overcome his fear. Each of them was there because they understood how important it was to talk about these issues and how they could impact society. This community became a source of strength for him. The event was scheduled for Saturday, and that day the entire team gathered in the park. The pleasant morning sun shone on their faces, creating an atmosphere of hope. People came with signs with slogans calling for equality and justice. We will not be silent, and all lives matter, the signs screamed, and that was exactly what Michael wanted the world to hear. When more people than expected showed up, his heart swelled with pride. He saw familiar faces, his friends, family, even some teachers who had come to support them. Everyone who came understood that this was not just a protest, but a manifestation of the desire for change. Laura spoke first. She spoke with such passion and confidence that every syllable she uttered resonated in the hearts of the audience. "We are here today to show that racism has no place in our society. We will speak out about our experiences and we will not allow our voices to be silenced." Her words drew a standing ovation. After her, Michael came on stage. His heart was pounding, and he paused for a moment to collect himself, but then he saw the smiling faces in the crowd, and it gave him confidence. He stood in front of the microphone and began to speak. "I am here to share my story. I was not arrested for anything I did, but only for the color of my skin. This is wrong. I know I am not alone, and we are all here to fight for change." Michael spoke with confidence and passion. He continued to talk about his experiences, about how his life had changed since the incident. The people in the crowd listened to him without distraction. He spoke of the fear he felt the day he was arrested, of the humiliation he had experienced, but also of hope that change was possible. When he finished, he saw tears in the eyes of some of the listeners. It was not just a protest, but a real act of compassion and understanding. People came up to him, hugged him and thanked him for his courage. It gave him strength. The whole day was spent in an atmosphere of unity and support. Activists shared their stories, and Michael felt that each of them was an important part of something bigger. They held several creative competitions, where children drew, expressing their feelings and thoughts about racism. Later, local musicians joined them and the crowd began to dance to the rhythms of their music. This created an atmosphere of unity and joy. Despite all the difficulties they faced, they understood that their fight for equality and justice was common. However, at this time, there were also counter-processions taking place in the city. In different parts of the city, there were groups of opponents who could not come to terms with the demands for change. These groups shouted insults and threatened the protesters. Michael, being in the crowd, felt the tension growing. He understood that despite all the positive changes, hatred still existed and they needed to be prepared for clashes. At one point, a group of people came to the protest with placards containing racist slogans. They started shouting and provoking the crowd. This situation immediately changed the atmosphere. The initially peaceful and joyful gathering turned into a battlefield of words. People in the crowd began to show tension. Laura, noticing what was happening, decided to take control of the situation. She raised her hand and called on everyone to remain calm. "We are here to fight for peace and justice, not for hatred. Let's not give in to provocations." Michael felt his heart sink in fear. He didn't want their protest to turn violent, but instead, he saw many people responding to the hate with love. People in the crowd began to sing, chanting positive slogans to drown out the screams of the haters. It was incredible. Little by little, the group of opponents began to retreat, unable to cope with the powerful spirit of unity and solidarity that emanated from the protesters. This was a great achievement for Michael and his friends. They realized that together they could overcome hatred, and this gave them strength. As the day wore on, activists held a roundtable to discuss how to move forward. They agreed that this was just the beginning and that they needed to work to change the system and combat bias and racism in their city. Michael felt a fire ignite inside him. He knew they could do much to change public opinion and create a better future. "We must continue to speak out and act. We cannot allow our experience to go unheard," he said with determination. After the meeting, they began planning their next action. There was a sense of unity and hope in their hearts. Despite all the difficulties, they knew that together they could achieve something great. At that moment, Michael promised himself that he would continue to fight for change, for his story, and for the stories of everyone who had ever experienced bias. The next day, when he woke up, his heart was still full of hope. He knew there was a lot of work ahead, but he was ready to take on the challenge. He knew that together with his friends and like-minded people, they could change the world for the better, and that became his goal, his dream, and he was determined to achieve it. After the successful campaign in the park, Michael couldn't forget what had happened. He was thinking about how important it was to continue the fight for justice and equality. He felt energized, but also aware that there was still much work to do. Despite the positive changes in public opinion, prejudice and racism were still deeply rooted in society. Michael knew that organizing actions alone was not enough. It was necessary to change people's consciousness, their attitude towards racial issues, so he began planning the next stage of his campaign. With a group of activists, they decided to organize a series of workshops and meetings to educate young people about human rights, the history of racism, and ways to combat bias. They wanted to create a safe space where people could share their stories and feelings without fear of judgment. They understood that conversation is the first step to change. Every night they would meet in the library, creating plans and developing materials for the workshops. Michael felt like he was part of something bigger than just fighting for his rights. He was part of a movement that was trying to change the system and create a society free of hate. He prepared presentations and looked for inspiring stories that could serve as examples for others. One day, while looking through old documents in the library, he came across the story of his grandfather, who also faced racism in his life. His grandfather often talked about how he fought for his rights, working in difficult conditions and teaching young people not to give up. Inspired by this story, Michael knew he needed to share it with others. As the group gathered, he suggested including the story in their workshop. "I want to tell the story of my grandfather. His story inspired me, and I believe it can inspire others. We must remember that our roots and heritage also play an important role in our struggle," he said. Everyone agreed, and Michael began to prepare a story about his grandfather. He studied details of his life, photographs and old letters. In every detail he saw a reflection of his struggle, resilience and love for his loved ones. He understood that this was not just his personal story, but the story of all those who have ever faced prejudice. The workshops began a few weeks later, and the first meeting was well attended. There were people both young and old, which gave him hope. They chose the topic, "The Power of Story to Fight Racism." Michael walked onto the stage with a notebook and a slide deck, his voice confident as he began sharing his grandfather's story. "My grandfather always said that if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you, and it won't be the way you want it to be," he began. He talked about how his grandfather faced prejudice while working on a farm and how he fought for his rights. He talked about how his grandfather would organize meetings with neighbors and share his knowledge about how to change their lives. The audience listened with bated breath. At the end of his speech, Michael invited everyone to share their stories, just like his grandfather had. "Each of us has the right to speak, and that is what can change society," he said. Laura was the first to speak, sharing how her parents faced prejudice when they were looking for a new home. She spoke of the rejections and humiliations they faced, and how it affected her perception of herself and her family. "I'll never forget my mother crying when we lost the house we fought for," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Others began to share their stories, and the atmosphere became more open and warm. Each story was unique, but each shared a sense of pain and a desire for change. There was a sense of unity in the room, and Michael felt the fear that had previously held him back begin to subside. He realized that they were all together, one big family, fighting for a common cause. After the workshop, many people approached Michael and thanked him for sharing his experience. It was so inspiring that he decided to make these meetings regular. He dreamed of creating a community where everyone could feel heard and supported. Not everyone was so enthusiastic, however. Rumors and even threats against the activists began to circulate around town. Some locals, fearful of their influence, began spreading rumors that their events were inciting violence. This caused alarm among Michael and his group, and they decided to hold another meeting to discuss how to handle the situation. At this meeting, they began to discuss possible security measures and how to protect participants. "We must not let fear stop us," Laura said. "Our goal is to continue to speak out and act. We must be prepared for the fact that there will be opposition to us." Meanwhile, discussions began on social media. Many were supportive, but some were insulting and threatening. Michael, looking through the comments, felt the hatred raising its head again. He knew they had a lot of hardships ahead, but he was not going to give up. One evening, he and his friends met at a cafe to discuss how they could expand their activities. "We could create an online campaign," one of the girls suggested. "That would allow us to reach more people and spread our idea." Michael nodded. "That's a good idea. We can post, share our stories, and ask people for support. Not only will it help us bring people together, but it will also show that we're not alone." The idea of creating an online campaign was met with enthusiasm. They began planning how to create content that would be interesting and informative. By the next meeting, they had prepared several posts and schedules for publication. Each of them took on the task. and soon they created social media pages where they shared their stories, important news and events. It became a real community where people could exchange experiences and find support. However, as they developed their campaign, their opponents also became active. A local group opposed to their actions began organizing their own events, which created tension in the community. One day, when Michael and his friends were holding a meeting at a local center, they received threats from the group. "We know what you're doing, and you don't need to be here," some of the opponents said menacingly. This made the activists feel unprotected and vulnerable. But Michael knew that leaving was not an option. He gathered his friends and said, "We can't let them intimidate us. We have to keep fighting for what's right." Words of encouragement and determination lit a fire in their hearts. At their next meeting, they discussed security measures and decided to work with local authorities to ensure the safety of their events. "We need to show that we are not here for conflict, but to change the situation for the better," Laura said. Discussions continued and soon they decided to hold a joint action with other groups working on social change. This would help unite their efforts and show that they were not alone. Together, they organized a large march to which they invited everyone. It was to be a significant event to demonstrate unity and solidarity. Michael, feeling a wave of inspiration, prepared to speak at the event. He knew that this would be his chance to once again speak out for his rights and the rights of others. On the day of the march, hundreds of people gathered in the streets, each one of them burning with a desire to change the world. The sun was shining and the air was filled with hope and unity. The slogans were heard, and it was incredible. Their voices intertwined into a single stream demanding change. Michael walked through the crowd, knowing that they were part of something much bigger than just fighting for their rights. This was a movement for justice and equality for all, and he was proud to be a part of it. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but with the support of their friends and supporters, they were ready to fight for what was right. With the march taking place in solidarity and unity, it seemed that the movement for change was beginning to gain traction. However, Michael and his friends knew that they were facing a serious challenge. The confrontation they had anticipated was getting closer to their reality. The evening after the march, Michael returned home, full of emotions and impressions. He felt that their voices had finally been heard, but the joy quickly turned to anxiety when he saw a news report about the march on television. The presenters discussed the events with obvious discontent and incompetence, accusing the participants of provocations and disturbing public order. "There is chaos in the streets again, and this march has become a place for discontent," said one of the commentators. The comment cut him to the heart. He knew that people had come to stand up for their rights and to speak out against injustice. The discussions in the news not only distorted their intentions, but also fueled hatred for the movement. Threats and insults began to appear in the comments on social media. Gathered with a group of activists at a regular meeting, Michael shared his concerns. "If we don't act now, we will continue to be portrayed as a threat. We need to make our voices heard and stop putting up with this negative coverage," he said, his voice full of determination. Laura nodded. "We need to organize a meeting with the local media to explain what we really want to change. We need to take a proactive stance on this." The others supported her suggestion, and they began planning how to get their ideas out to a wider audience. They soon contacted local journalists to organize a press conference. At that point, they realized that their movement had attracted not only supporters but also opponents, who began to gather in groups to protest their actions. Each gathering sparked new arguments and discontent. At the press conference, Michael spoke first. He walked up to the microphone, and the room fell silent. "We are here to talk about equality and justice. We do not want to create conflict. We want dialogue. Our goal is to change public opinion, which has been biased for so long," he began. When he finished, hands went up in the room and reporters began asking questions. "How can you assure the public that your intentions are sincere when your actions are causing such a stir?" One reporter asked. "We understand that some people perceive our actions as a threat, but this is not the case. We encourage dialogue and want everyone to be able to express their feelings. We are here to unite people, not to divide them," Michael responded, his voice sounding confident. The discussion continued, with many activists taking part. Laura also stood up to share her experiences. "I have seen my family suffer from bias, and I am not here to cause chaos, but to let people know that we all have the right to equality," she said. Some journalists began asking more aggressive questions, highlighting public fears. "How can you explain the actions of some members of your group who were seen in conflict with opponents?" Michael and Laura exchanged glances. Our group strives to maintain order and safety, but we cannot control everyone's actions. We continue to call for peace and unity, Michael said, his voice firm. The press conference ended with the hope that their message would reach the public. However, behind the scenes, threats remained. Some opponents of their movement began actively creating social media groups calling for violence and hatred. Michael knew they had to be prepared for potential conflicts. A few days later, when they gathered again at the center, the atmosphere was tense. Many people expressed their fears, and Michael felt their strength beginning to wane. We need to remain resilient despite the fear. We must be prepared for any challenge, he said. It was at this point that they decided to take a step toward creating a support system. They organized a meeting where everyone could share their fears and concerns. This created a space for open dialogue, and many began to share their experiences. Among them was a young woman named Tiffany, who spoke of her fears about participating in the protests. "I'm afraid that someone might get hurt. I don't want any of us to be in danger because of hate," she said, her voice shaking. "I understand, and that's why we need to work together to keep ourselves safe," Laura replied. "We can create a support group where we share information about safety and how to act in dangerous situations." Michael agreed to the proposal, and soon they created chats and groups on social media to inform each other of any threats. They developed a plan of action in case someone experienced violence. This gave the participants a sense of security and unity. Despite their fear, they continued to act. They planned another march that would go through the entire city. It was not only a show of strength, but also an opportunity to demonstrate their unity in the face of opposition. People began to spread the word about the march, and gradually interest in it grew. But on the day of the march, the clouds began to gather again. This time, the opponents were reportedly gathering in large numbers, with some already calling for violence. This fear made many wonder whether they should participate. Michael and Laura decided to meet before the march to revisit safety precautions and support each other. "I know a lot of you are scared, and that's okay, but remember, we're in this together, and that's important," Michael said. At this point, one of the local journalists approached them. "We hear about your plans, and many of our viewers are interested in what will happen. How are you preparing for possible clashes?" he asked. "We are prepared for any situation, but we hope that we can hold this march peacefully. Our goal is to show that we bring love, not hate," Laura replied, her voice full of confidence. When they took to the streets, the atmosphere was tense but also hopeful. Protesters carried signs that read "Love is stronger than hate and unity is strength." These words sent a powerful message, and many, including those who were wary, decided to join them. As they walked through the city streets, voices could be heard chanting slogans about equality and justice. Suddenly, opponents appeared in the distance, and Michael felt his heart beat faster. He knew that this moment could be critical. As they got closer, the protesters began shouting insults and threats. It was hard to take in, and fear filled many of the activists. But Michael remembered the importance of remaining calm. "Remember, we are here to advocate for peace. Don't let hatred cloud your purpose," he shouted, his voice full of power. The crowd of activists joined hands, and this gesture of unity gave them courage. They began to sing a song of peace, and the melody sounded in the air like hope for the future. Like magic, the hatred of the opponents began to weaken, and the screams became quieter. However, Michael knew they had to be prepared for the situation to change at any moment. He felt responsible for his friends and everyone who had come to support this movement. Suddenly, a group of opponents began to move towards them, and Michael saw some of them raise their hands, preparing for a conflict. "Don't let them provoke you," he shouted. "We are here to claim our rights, and nothing can stop us." The crowd responded with a single, powerful cry of determination. Meanwhile, the police, noticing the escalation of the conflict, began to close in, but Michael hoped they would see that there was nothing here but a desire for peace. He knew that their actions could determine what the future would look like. Still, the tension in the air was unbearable. Michael prayed that they could make it through this without facing the violence they all feared. Every step was a step toward change, and they were willing to fight for it. But they also understood that many challenges lay ahead, and this confrontation would only be the beginning of a long journey towards change. What was supposed to be a symbol of unity and strength suddenly turned into a scene of chaos. The standoff with a group of counter-protesters escalated as they began throwing objects and shouting insults. Michael and his friends tried not to give in to the provocations, but the tension in the air was palpable. The police officers who were once supposed to protect the protesters were now on the verge of dispersing the crowd, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. As one of the opponents stepped forward and began threatening the participants, Michael felt fear pierce through him, but it was at that moment that he realized that they held the power to change everything. "Remember, we are not here to fight, we are here to talk. We want peace and equality," he shouted, trying to get his message across to everyone around him. Michael's words resonated with the protesters, and they began to sing again. The melody created a shield against hatred and aggression, but while one front was growing stronger, another was becoming more fragile. Michael noticed some of his friends beginning to doubt. Their eyes showed uncertainty, fear, and a desire to leave this hot spot. "We can't give up," he said, turning to Laura and the others. "We have to remember why we're here. It's not just for us, it's for everyone who suffers from bias." Michael raised the flag that symbolized their movement, and its energy spread to those around him. People began to gather around again, and this energy lifted their spirits. But at this time, the opponents began to approach closer, and many of the protesters began to feel a growing fear. Suddenly, there was a loud noise. Someone from the group of opponents threw a rock, and it hit one of the activists. The crowd froze, and Michael saw one of his friends, Jordan, fall to the ground. Michael's heart began to pound, and he felt that this moment could be a turning point. "Stay together," he shouted as the police sprang into action. Some officers tried to calm the situation, while others began to disperse the protesters, who were joined by locals who came to help. In the panic, Michael lost sight of Laura, which caused him great anxiety. "Laura," he shouted, pushing his way through the crowd, but his cry was lost in the sounds of chaos. He continued forward, pushing his way through the crowd, when he suddenly saw her standing surrounded by several aggressive opponents. They were threatening her, and Michael's heart pounded with fear. He knew he couldn't let anything happen to her. "Hey, get your hands off her," he shouted, trying to push his way through the crowd. His voice was so loud that it attracted the attention of not only the marchers but also the police, who sprang into action. Some of the opponents, noticing Michael, tried to come closer, but his words rang out with determination. "We are not here to fight, we are here to defend our rights." Michael finally reached Laura, who was in a panic, but her eyes met his and it gave her hope. "I'm with you," he said, hugging her and distracting the opponents. While they were holding together, the police began to ease the pressure on the crowd. Some of them tried to create a corridor so that the protesters could leave the dangerous area. This gave everyone the opportunity to leave the hot spot, and they rushed to a safer area. When they finally emerged from the chaos, Michael and Laura were both exhausted but determined. "We can't let this stop us," he said, looking into her eyes. "We need to continue our fight for justice, despite everything that's going on around us." Meanwhile, across town, the mayor, who was aware of the events, watched the news reports of the protests. He felt his heart tighten with concern for his nephew, who was caught in the middle of this conflict. "I need to intervene," he told himself, realizing that this was not just his personal matter, it was a matter of public order. The mayor gathered his advisors and began discussing how to stop the escalation of violence while supporting the rights of the protesters. He knew that every voice mattered, and his intervention could change the course of events. He called local news outlets and asked for the opportunity to address the people with a call for peace. At this point, Michael and his friends gathered their strength and began discussing how they could continue their actions safely. They knew they had to act quickly or things could end badly. They soon decided to hold their next action in a park where they could gather more people and create space for dialogue. This idea was supported by everyone and they began to develop a plan. Each participant was assigned a role to organize this process. They understood that their struggle would not end until change was achieved, and they were ready for it. Gathering in the park the next day, they prepared posters with slogans about peace and unity. This time, they decided not to create a cause for conflict. Instead, they wanted to demonstrate what community united by a common goal could look like. As they prepared for the action, news reports about it began to appear on the air. The mayor also made a statement calling for peace and dialogue, and his words became new symbols of hope for many. "We must work together to create a better society for everyone, regardless of skin color." he said, encouraging people to join the movement. Michael and his team felt that this could be a defining moment for their fight. They knew that there were many challenges ahead, but they also knew that they were not alone. They had people behind them ready to support them in this important fight for equality and justice. As the protests began, the parks filled with people who came to show their support. Everyone felt like they were part of something bigger, and that gave them strength. Michael looked at his friends and saw the determination in their eyes. "Today we will show that together we can create change," he said, raising the flag. This demonstration of unity and solidarity marked the beginning of a new stage in their struggle, and they were ready to continue moving forward despite all the difficulties and fears that lay in wait for them along the way. A sunny day illuminated the park where the activists had gathered. The atmosphere was full of hope and determination. People holding signs with the words "Justice for All" and "Equality Now" created a powerful image of unity. This action, organized by Michael and his friends, was not only meant to demonstrate their goals, but also to be a place for open dialogue between different groups of society. As Michael stepped onto the makeshift stage created from a few boxes, he felt goosebumps run down his spine. "We are here today to make a statement, to demonstrate that we are not just a voice in the crowd, but a collective force for change," he shouted, and the crowd responded with thunderous applause and cheers. Laura stood next to him, clutching the microphone. She knew that this day was a major turning point for their movement. "We are here to speak not only of our suffering, but also of our hope for the future," she said, and the people shouted again. She continued, "We don't want to live in fear anymore. We want to be heard and understood." Michael nodded, feeling a surge of strength from her words. There were many questions ahead, but they both knew this was just the beginning. As they began to discuss their ideas and goals, more and more people joined in, and soon the park was filled with loud conversations and laughter. This was more than just a meeting, it was a true show of unity. Meanwhile, the police, watching the action, decided to take control of the situation. Ensuring safety, the police stood along the edges of the park, some of them exchanging discontented glances, but Michael and Laura noticed that there were many in their ranks who looked friendly and supportive. This gave them hope. Once activists began sharing their stories, a variety of topics emerged. People spoke about their experiences, the injustices they had faced, and how they had fought against bias. One speaker, an elderly man, spoke about how his son had been falsely arrested just a few years earlier, and his words brought tears to many. "I was sure that justice would prevail, but the system betrayed us. But today I see that together we can change this." His voice trembled, and the crowd greeted his words with thunderous applause. This moment showed everyone that their story was not just a story of loneliness, but a collective struggle. A few hours passed, and the attention turned back to Michael and Laura. They knew this was their chance to convey not only their ideas, but also the importance of further action. "Let's not just talk about change, let's take action. We have the power to make the world a better place, and each of us can make a difference," Michael urged. People began to discuss how they could continue the fight after the event. They came up with ideas about hosting educational events, working with local organizations, and helping each other combat bias in their communities. Everyone felt like they could do something meaningful. But not everyone was positive. Those in the crowd began to speak out against their actions. Suddenly, a scream was heard and the crowd turned. A group of opponents, who had come with signs, shouted insults. The situation began to escalate, and the protesters felt fear return. "Don't let them intimidate us," Michael shouted, raising his hand to draw attention to himself. "We are here to stand up for our rights, and no one can take that away." His words made an impact, and the protesters began to respond with a unified cry, "We are not afraid." At this point, Laura noticed that some of the activists were starting to get nervous and disperse. She picked up the microphone and looked out at the crowd and said, "Our strength is in unity. We cannot let hate divide us. Together we are stronger." The crowd roared again, and it was a powerful reminder of what they were fighting for. But as the group of opponents began to approach, the police finally took action. They created a corridor between the two groups, and this caused another tension. "Maintain order," one officer shouted. He tried to calm the situation, but the noise grew. Michael knew he had to act quickly. "Let's show that we can be peaceful. We're here to express our ideas, not to quarrel." He called for peace again. Laura hugged him, and they both felt their bond grow stronger. At that moment, the city mayor, who was also present at the action, came up on stage. He looked at the protesters and opponents. We are all here because we care about our future. I call on you to peace and dialogue." His words were full of power, and the protesters felt supported. "We must work together to create a community where everyone feels safe. This is not just one group's issue, this is our entire community's issue," the mayor continued. His words laid bare the underlying issues people in their city were facing, and it began to resonate with both sides. The mayor's words seemed to calm the situation. The protesters began to gather together, realizing that their unity really did matter. The opponents, having listened to the mayor, began to leave, and the crowd of protesters united again, beginning to chant. This song of peace and hope was a promise that their struggle was not over. They knew there would be trials ahead, but together they were ready for any challenge. In that moment, they felt the power of their movement and the confidence that they could achieve their goals. When the event was over, everyone was tired but determined. Michael and Laura knew this was just the beginning. They agreed to meet the following week to discuss next steps and continue working on their mission. And although there were challenges ahead, they were confident that together they could change the world around them for the better. It wasn't just a fight for rights, it was a movement that brought people together. Each of them understood that their unity was what would help them overcome all difficulties, and they were ready to continue their path to change, despite any obstacles. The day after the successful action, there was a wave of hope in the air, but also anxiety. Michael, Laura and their friends met in a cafe to discuss what to do next. There was a growing sense that their movement was gaining more attention from both the local community and the media. The atmosphere in the cafe was friendly, but there was apprehension in the eyes of the young people. "What's next? How can we keep this energy going and make sure people don't forget about our movement?" Laura asked. Looking at the faces of her friends, they knew they couldn't miss this moment. "We need to continue to organize events and raise important issues," suggested Jordan, one of their comrades. "Educational seminars, meetings with local government officials, all of this will help us get our point across to a wider audience." Michael nodded, feeling that this was a really important step. He knew that their efforts needed to become more organized and focused, and we need to make sure that we're covering different aspects to reach more people. "We need to talk about not just racism, but social justice in general," he added. Meanwhile, news of the protests began to spread around the city. Local TV and radio stations discussed the events, and soon conversations about racial prejudice and bias became part of everyday conversations. People began to ask questions about how public perceptions could be improved, and this created an opportunity for dialogue. But not everyone was happy with this wave of change. In the shadow of the events, tensions were growing. The group members who opposed the activists began organizing their own events. They had hatred in their hearts, and they tried to impose their ideas using aggressive tactics. One day, as Michael and his team were preparing for another meeting at a cafe, they noticed that several men with aggressive expressions were watching them. "Look, it looks like we're being followed again," Jordan said, pointing to the group that was approaching. Their presence made the guys uneasy. "Don't be provoked," Michael said, trying to remain calm. "We mustn't give them the opportunity to ruin our mood." But it wasn't easy. The hatred they were radiating was making everyone feel afraid. Soon one of the men came closer. "You think you can just talk about equality? This is not your time," he growled, looking at the group with disdain. The words were full of hatred, and the tension in the air became unbearable. Michael and his friends tried to remain cool. "We're here to talk about peace and justice, not to quarrel," he replied, trying to steer the conversation in a peaceful direction. "We're not going to leave, and you can't intimidate us." The man just chuckled, and his friends began to approach. Suddenly, a scream rang out in the cafe as one of them collided with Jordan. "I'm not afraid of you," Jordan shouted, and the conflict quickly escalated. Luckily, the owner of the cafe saw the situation and intervened. "Hey, if you're going to start a fight, you better leave. We value peace and respect here," he said, pointing to the door. This bold stance from the owner gave Michael and his team a boost, and they began to pack up, preparing to leave. As they left the cafe, Michael knew that the fight for change would be difficult, but now he also understood that they were not alone. Many people, like the cafe owner, supported them, and this gave them strength. Back at their place, the team began to formulate a plan. They decided to hold their next event at a local library, where people interested in racial justice issues gathered. "We can make it a place where people can share their stories and experiences," Laura suggested. The next day they started preparing. They printed flyers inviting everyone to the event. Every detail was important, and they tried to attract as many people as possible. They understood that they needed to use this opportunity to start a movement that could reach not only their city, but also neighboring regions. When the day of the event arrived, the library was full of people, many of whom had come to share their experiences and ask questions. It was a wonderful sight to see people of all ages and races come together to discuss important issues. Michael opened the event, again emphasizing the importance of unity. "We're here to talk about justice, about how we can make our world a better place," he said, and the crowd applauded his words. People began sharing their stories, and among them was not only pain and suffering, but also hope. Each speaker brought new insights and showed that behind each face there are real human stories. This became the basis for working together. During the discussion, they touched on a variety of topics, including the need for education about racial bias, the impact of social media, and the need to engage with government officials. It was an important time for dialogue, and participants began to think about how they could put what they had learned into practice. But talk of hatred and violence soon began to resurface. One activist, speaking on stage, said he had been attacked just a few days earlier. "I don't have to fear for my life when I walk down the street," he said, his words thick with fear and pain. As he spoke, Michael and Laura exchanged a look of understanding. They knew that this fight would not end until every heart was safe. "We must fight to turn every word of hate into a word of love," Laura added. The event generated a lot of ideas about how to proceed. They began to discuss creating support groups and educational programs that would help people understand each other better. Everyone wanted to contribute to the movement, and this energy filled them with optimism. At the end of the event, as people began to leave, Michael stood on the stage, watching them leave the library. A sense of hope was rekindled in his heart. He knew there was still work to do, but now he didn't feel alone. He had a team, he had support, and their fight was just beginning. That evening, they returned home determined to keep moving forward. Each of them knew that their strength and determination would only grow with each passing day. Now that they had begun their journey, they knew that they could make the changes they dreamed of. Their unity was their powerful weapon in the fight for justice, and they were ready to continue the fight until the end. A few weeks had passed since Michael and Laura held the event at the library, and the wave of activity continued to grow. More and more people were gathering around them, wanting to support the movement. Michael knew this was their chance to do something meaningful, but not everyone was supportive of their efforts. One day, after receiving reports of local groups actively opposing their ideas, Michael and his team decided to organize a meeting with police and local authorities. They hoped that open dialogue would help resolve tensions and create a basis for cooperation. That evening, the local youth center was filled with volunteers, and the anticipation was evident on people's faces. Michael and Laura sat in the foreground, preparing to explain their goals. "We are here to talk about safety and understanding," Michael began, addressing the participants. "We want to be heard, and we want to work together to create a safer community for everyone." But when the discussions began, several of the police officers who attended the meeting seemed disinterested, even aggressive. One officer, Ben, clearly didn't take them seriously. "You want us to trust you first, but you don't have a single plan for how to do that," he said, his voice full of contempt. The crowd grew nervous. Laura, sensing the tension, tried to intervene. "We have lots of ideas and suggestions, but we need your help. We have to work together, not against each other." But Ben continued to mock them, questioning their intentions. At this point, one of the activists stood up and began to talk about his experience with the police. "I was arrested on a false charge, and no one listened to me. I don't need the police looking at me like a criminal just because of the color of my skin." His words caused cheers and applause in the hall. In response, Ben crossed his arms and grinned. "Your problem is that you don't respect the law." This caused a real storm of emotions among the participants. "How can you talk about the law when you yourself can't tell a criminal from an innocent person?" shouted another activist. The altercation began to escalate and soon the situation got out of control. The police began to threaten the participants, indicating that they could call for backup if the situation did not calm down. This caused panic and some participants began to leave the hall. Michael, seeing the crowd leaving, felt the need to act. He stood up and said, "Stop, we're not here to fight, we're here to find solutions. We can talk about what divides us, or we can talk about what unites us." These words calmed the crowd down a bit, but Ben wasn't going to give in. He continued to provoke the activists, and soon the situation heated up again. "If you want change so badly, why don't you work on your behavior?" he said, a comment that caused even more anger. At this point, Laura raised her hand. "We are not here to blame, but to seek dialogue. But you must also understand our feelings. We are tired of fear and hatred." This statement resonated with the participants, and many began to support her. Meanwhile, Michael sensed that the situation was about to get out of hand. He knew he needed to ease the tension and try to steer the conversation in a more constructive direction. "Let's talk about how we can work together. We want safety, and it seems like you want respect. How can we find common ground?" Some of the police officers began to talk among themselves, and it became obvious that even they realized that the situation was getting out of control. However, Ben was not going to back down. He continued to provoke people, claiming that they were to blame for their own problems. Eventually, the police stood up and started to leave the room, declaring that if the activists did not calm down, they would call for backup. This caused confusion and fear among those present. "What do we do now? We can't just give up," Laura whispered to Michael as he watched the dwindling numbers of participants. After the police left, the activists gathered in a circle and began to discuss what had happened. It became clear to many that open dialogue with the authorities might be more difficult than they had expected. "We have to be prepared for the fact that we will not always be listened to," one of the girls noted, "but that does not mean we should give up." Michael nodded, realizing the fight was just beginning. "We have to keep going. We have to be united and keep talking about what's important." They began to develop an action plan, which included using social media to spread the word about their cause and get people involved. The next morning, Michael woke up with a clear goal in mind. He knew they needed to use the incident at the meeting as an opportunity for growth. He gathered his team and suggested creating a video message in which they could explain their intentions and encourage people to engage in dialogue rather than conflict. As they began filming, each shared their own experiences and visions for the future. "We have to show people that we are not against the police, but we are against bias and violence," Michael said. "We have to be the voice of those who cannot speak, and do it with love, not hate." Once the video was ready, they posted it on their social media pages and started sharing it with friends. The reaction was mixed. Many were supportive, but some started writing angry comments. But Michael knew that shouldn't stop them. Every day, the number of people joining their movement only increased. People began sharing their stories, and a lot of discussions about racism and bias began on social media. It opened up a public dialogue, and although they still had a lot of work to do, they felt like they were moving in the right direction. Despite the threats and hatred they faced, Michael and his team knew they had support. They began planning their next event, where people could come together and share their stories. It would be an opportunity for anyone who wanted to make a difference in society. When the day of the protest arrived, the park was filled with people. People came to share their experiences and talk about how they could work together for justice. Michael and Laura felt that their fight was becoming more meaningful. It was a time when they could bring people together, and it gave them hope. On this day they learned that true strength lies in unity, and despite all the difficulties, they were ready to continue their fight for justice and equality. After a successful park rally that drew hundreds of people, Michael and his team became a symbol of hope and change in the community. The public began to respond to their efforts, and news outlets began to cover their movement, but with increased attention came new challenges. One day, when Michael was returning home after a long day of working on projects, he noticed that he was being followed. A strange car followed him for several blocks. Anxiety crept into his heart. "What if it's the same guys who followed us to the cafe again?" he thought. As soon as he entered his house, he immediately dialed Laura's number. "Listen, I think I'm being followed. I just noticed a suspicious car following me," he said, feeling the tension rise. "Are you okay? Where are you now?" Laura asked quickly. Michael reassured her that he was home and had locked the door. "We can't let them bully us," he continued. "We need to let the others know and be prepared for any consequences." Laura agreed. "Let's get everyone together for an emergency meeting. We need to talk about safety and how we can protect ourselves and our movement," she suggested. They agreed to meet at a cafe, which would become their base for organizing. The next day, all the activists gathered in the cafe. There was an air of anxiety in the air. Michael shared his story of what had happened the day before, and his account was disturbing. "We all know the risk we take when we speak out against the system," he said. looking at his friends. But we can't let fear stop us. Laura suggested some precautions. We should create security groups. If one of us sees something suspicious, we should act together to protect each other, she said. Many supported her idea, and they began to discuss how these groups could be organized. Meanwhile, polarization was growing in the city. Members of opposing groups began to gather to organize their own rallies, which only added to the tension. Threats and insults were posted on social media aimed at activists. This was not just an expression of discontent, it was an open declaration of hatred, and with each new post, fear hung in the air. That evening, as the activists were gathering to discuss their upcoming actions, there was a noise outside. From outside their window, they saw a group of masked men marching down the street, carrying signs and flags full of hate. This was not just a small gathering, it was an organization seeking to stop their movement. Michael stood up and said, "We can't let them destroy what we've built. We have to be prepared to defend ourselves and our right to free expression." At that moment, he felt the entire team united in a single goal. Their determination only grew stronger. As they went outside to meet the protesters, Michael noticed that many of the activists were beginning to panic. "Don't be afraid, we're not here to fight, we're here to talk," he shouted, trying to keep them calm. He knew that if they didn't show resolve, fear would take over. The protesters began chanting, their slogans loud and aggressive. "Get out of our city," they shouted, and it carried a lot of hate. Michael knew they needed to present an alternative to this cry of hate. He stepped forward and began to speak. "We are here to talk about love, about understanding, and how we can live together." Some protesters began shouting back, and fearful faces appeared among the activists. But despite this, many began to support Michael. "We don't want conflict, but we're not going to give in," one of the girls shouted. The situation was becoming increasingly tense, and Michael knew this was no time for weakness. He and his team began singing songs of peace and solidarity. Their voices were powerful, and over time, some of the protesters began to fall silent and listen. This power of unity could change the atmosphere. Suddenly, sirens began to sound. Police cars pulled up to the scene. "Here they are, just in time," Laura whispered. Many of the activists began to get nervous. When the police got out of their cars, they quickly assessed the situation. Then, the same officer who had provoked them at the meeting, approached a group of protesters and began to explain something. The situation was getting tense, and Michael felt that it could lead to unrest. "We have to act quickly," he told his team. "Let's explain to the police that we are here to protest peacefully." They gathered their forces and approached the police. "We are peaceful protesters and we are here to talk about justice and understanding," Michael said. Ben, arms crossed, looked at him incredulously. "What is going on here? Why don't you disperse? This is an illegal rally," he said, not wanting to hear their words. "We have a right to express our thoughts, and we are here to find common ground," Laura replied, but Ben would not listen. He began threatening to arrest the protesters if they did not disperse. Michael knew they couldn't back down. We're not leaving this question unanswered," he shouted, and that inspired the others. Suddenly, some of the participants began chanting, "We demand justice, we demand love." Michael felt their strength grow. He noticed the protesters begin to freeze, their cries become quieter. Ben, seeing this, looked confused. A look of confusion flashed in his eyes. Michael continued, "We are here to work together, not against each other. Let's talk." And then a miracle happened. The police began to group together and listen. The activists' shouts became less aggressive, and there was a sense in the air that they might be able to establish a dialogue. "Okay, we'll talk," Ben said, realizing he couldn't go on like this. "But if you don't disperse, we'll be forced to disperse you." Michael, feeling that they had made some progress, took the floor. "We agree to part ways if you agree to listen to us next time. Let's set up a meeting and discuss all the issues that are troubling us all." The proposal raised eyebrows, but Ben eventually agreed. "We'll arrange a meeting, but you have to be prepared for constructive dialogue." When Michael gathered his team, he felt like it was a turning point. Not only were they able to keep the peace, but they were opening the door to communication. In that moment, they realized that their fight was not only about justice, but also about building bridges between people, and that was the most important lesson they had ever learned. As the protesters began to disperse, Michael and Laura exchanged hopeful glances. "We're on the right track," she said. This is just the beginning, but we can make a difference. They knew they had a lot of work ahead of them, and their struggle would not end until the world was a better place for everyone. That evening, as they returned home, their hearts were full of hope and determination, and they were ready for the new challenges that lay ahead. After the meeting with the police and the successful action in the park, the activists felt that their efforts were beginning to bear fruit, but ahead was the long-awaited meeting with local authorities and the police, which they had long dreamed of. This was an opportunity to raise important issues regarding racial prejudice and the treatment of citizens. In the days leading up to the meeting, Michael's team had been busy preparing. They held a meeting where everyone could air their ideas and concerns. This meeting is our chance to show that we're not just a noisy group, but a united force for change, Michael said as they gathered at a coffee shop. Laura added, "We need to be prepared for any questions that may arise. Let's prepare a clear list of topics to discuss and make sure all our voices are heard." Each participant took responsibility for their part in the preparation, and this brought them together even more. When the day of the meeting arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew that this could be a critical moment for their movement. The City Hall building was filled with local government officials, several high-ranking police officers, and, of course, a group of activists ready to voice their opinions. As Michael walked into the conference room, he felt his heart beat faster. "We're here to talk about what really matters," he reminded himself. He sat down next to Laura and the other activists. They were surrounded by people in suits, further highlighting the contrast between their world and the world of power. The mayor spoke first, opening with a general greeting and an apology for the incidents that had occurred recently. "We understand that frustrations are growing in our community, and we are here to listen and learn," he said, but his words rang hollow. Michael noticed many of the activists began to whisper among themselves as the mayor continued his speech. He knew it was not just a matter of words, but of actions. "Listening is not enough. We need concrete measures to improve the situation," he said when the mayor finished. At this point, Ben, the same officer who had provoked them during the rally, spoke up. "We police officers are also people, and we want to serve our community," he began, but many in the room immediately reacted with displeasure. "But you don't listen to us," one activist exclaimed. "You never listen when we talk about our fears and worries." The comment caused a storm of emotion, and Michael realized that they needed to stick together to change the atmosphere. Michael stood up to speak. "We didn't come here to attack you, but to speak up about what's bothering us. We want cooperation, not confrontation," he said, looking at the police. "We want our voices to be heard, so that we can work together for the greater good." But Ben was clearly not going to give in. "You have to understand that police officers are also exposed to stress and danger on the job. You can't blame us all," he continued. This caused even more discontent among activists. "We are not blaming all police officers, but we are demanding accountability from those who use force unlawfully," someone in the crowd shouted. The statement was met with applause and cheers. Michael felt the activists were beginning to unite. Gradually, the discussion began to heat up. The police began to defend their position, but Michael and his team were not going to back down. They spoke about real-life examples of racial profiling and violence by law enforcement, emphasizing how it affected their lives. "I have a brother who was wrongly arrested once, just because he was black and in the wrong place," said one activist, his voice shaking with emotion. "This is not an isolated incident. We are here because this happens over and over again, and it has to stop." The discussion grew emotional, and Michael noticed that some of the police officers were beginning to show sympathy for their words. This gave him hope. "We want you to be our partners in this, not our adversaries," he continued. "We all want safety, but safety should not come at the expense of oppressing others." The mayor, observing the emotions in the hall, decided to intervene. "I propose that we organize roundtables where these issues will be discussed in more detail," he suggested. This caused some discontent among the activists, but they understood that this could be a step towards positive change. When the meeting ended, many activists felt more confident. Although they hadn't achieved all of their goals, they had started the dialogue that was needed to create change. "This is just the beginning," Laura noted as they left the room, "but we made them hear us." As they left City Hall, they were met by reporters outside. Michael realized that their words and actions were starting to generate interest, and this could be a good opportunity to further advance their cause. He addressed the camera. "We will continue to fight for justice and equality. We will not back down until our voices are heard." people in the crowd began to applaud, which gave the team confidence. They knew their fight would not end there, but every step forward was a step toward change. On the way home, they discussed how they could improve their plans to continue to raise awareness for their issues. Michael knew they had more work to do, and he was ready for it. "We have to unite with other groups to build a stronger movement," he said. "This is not just our fight, but the fight of everyone who faces bias and hate." With each passing day, their determination grew stronger. They began organizing workshops where they shared stories, and this attracted more and more people. Their movement began to grow, and together they were ready for the new challenges that lay ahead. With each passing day after the meeting with local authorities, the activists felt their movement growing. Each meeting attracted more people, and the issues they faced became more open. But with the growing support came new challenges. Opposing groups began to respond to their successes, and tensions in the city grew. Michael and his team knew they had to stay alert. One evening, as they gathered at a cafe to discuss the upcoming action, Laura noticed something strange. "Look, someone's watching us," she whispered, pointing to the window. Michael turned around and saw a group of people standing on the sidewalk, looking at them with displeasure. They were members of a countergroup that was actively trying to discredit the activists. "They may have come with the intention of provoking us," he said, looking at them with caution. The team decided not to give in to the provocation and continued their meeting, but there was tension in the air. They discussed plans for a future action aimed at drawing attention to the problem of racial profiling and police violence. "We need to do this peacefully but loudly," Michael said. "Our goal is not only to attract attention, but to show that we are united in this cause." He suggested creating a large poster display where people could express their feelings and experiences. Laura added, "Let's collect stories of people who have experienced bias and bring them to the event. It will be powerful." The idea was met with enthusiasm, and activists began planning how to put it into practice. Meanwhile, members of the countergroup began spreading false information about Michael's movement. They posted on social media, accusing activists of violence and riots. This caused division among people, and some began to question the activists' intentions. Michael and Laura realized they had to respond. "We need to tell our truth and put these rumors to rest," Laura said. "Let's have a press conference and share our stories." The proposal was supported by the entire team. At a press conference the following day, Michael addressed a crowd of reporters and locals. "We're here to set the record straight and to talk about our movement," he began. "We're not a violent group. We're here for justice and equality for all." He invited several activists to share their personal stories. They spoke about their experiences, about being arrested without cause, and how their lives were changed by racial prejudice. These sincere words touched the hearts of the audience and even some reporters. Laura stood up and finished her speech. "We are not here to hate. We are here to create unity. We want our voices to be heard and for people to start realizing that we are part of one society and that we all deserve to be treated fairly," she said. The press conference caused a stir. In the days following, many local media outlets began covering their struggle, which attracted even more people to their ranks. But with the rise in popularity came new threats. The countergroup began to intensify its activities, staging demonstrations and creating heated discussions on social media. One evening, as Michael was returning home, he noticed that he was being followed again. He felt anxiety grip his heart. "Will they really leave me alone?" he thought. Quickening his pace, he entered his house, locked the doors, and breathed a sigh of relief. But the calm didn't last long. The next day they received word that a counter-meeting had been scheduled for their next protest. This left them worried. "What should we do?" Laura asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "We have to stay united," Michael said. "We can't let them intimidate us. If they want to be violent, we have to show that we are peaceful protesters and that we are not afraid." The team discussed their strategy for the protests. They decided that it would be best to hold their events in the same places where their opponents were gathering, to show that they were not going to calm down and not retreat. The day of the action arrived. Michael and his team gathered in a park surrounded by flowers and posters full of slogans about peace and equality. But when they approached the site, they were met by an angry crowd of counter-protesters. People were shouting, whistling and holding signs with insults. Michael felt his heart sink. This wasn't just a standoff, it was a clash of two worlds. "We must remain calm," he whispered to his comrades. "This is not our war, but we must protect our values." The rally began and the activists began singing songs of peace and unity. In response, the opponents began chanting insults. Shouts of hate filled the air, but Michael knew their message had to be heard. Things got heated when some of the protesters started throwing things at the activists. At that point, Michael and his team, without losing their composure, started working to keep the action peaceful. They formed a chain and started moving towards the side where the hate was coming from, holding signs and slogans that promoted peace and solidarity. "We are here to speak of love, not hate," Michael shouted, raising his sign. The call inspired others, and many began to repeat his words. Some of the opponents began to slow down, realizing that their hatred was not resonating with those fighting for peace. However, tensions were rising and Michael knew the situation could get out of hand. Suddenly, he noticed one of the activists being the victim of aggressive behavior, being pushed and falling. This was the signal to act. Michael quickly raised his hand, urging everyone to remain calm. He walked over to his comrade, helped him up, and made sure everything was okay. "We will not give up," he said, looking at the other activists. "We must demonstrate our strength and unity." It was only when the police intervened that the situation began to calm down. The officers, seeing the intensity of the situation, began to separate the crowds and make sure no one was hurt. However, Michael felt that their message had been conveyed. They had shown that despite the pressure and hatred, they remained true to their principles. As the rally ended, the activists huddled together, cheering each other on. "We did it," Michael said, and everyone nodded. They knew there would be more challenges ahead, but their unity and determination had only grown stronger. That night, as they walked home, Michael felt they had been through the ordeal and had come out stronger. "We're going to keep fighting," he said, confident that there was more to come. This movement was just beginning, and they were ready for the next phase of their fight for justice. Several days had passed since the tense protests, and the activist team continued to receive support from the local community. But despite the positive changes, the opposition group was not about to give up. In recent weeks, their actions had become more aggressive, and this was causing deep concern for Michael and his friends. That morning, as they were planning their next meeting, Laura came with disturbing news. "I heard from several people that the opponents are planning some kind of action against us," she said, looking at the others. "It seems they are going to provoke us, to make us look bad in the eyes of the public. We can't let them take over," Michael said. "We have to prepare. We have to make sure we have a plan in case of provocation." They decided to hold a meeting to discuss what to do if the situation escalated. Once the activists gathered at a local cafe, they began to discuss their strategies. Each of them shared their experiences and offered ideas on how to prevent conflict. "We have to show that we are peaceful and that hatred will not solve anything," said one participant. Laura, having collected her thoughts, suggested holding the event under the slogan Unity Day. "It will be an opportunity to show that we are not just protesting against hatred, but also promoting love and understanding," she added. Everyone agreed with the idea. They began planning how to organize the day in a way that would involve as many people as possible. "We need to make this event as inclusive as possible. Let everyone feel like their voice matters," Michael said, inspiring the others. As they prepared for Unity Day, information about the countergroup continued to trickle in. Threats and calls for violence were posted on social media every night. Despite this, Michael and his team remained optimistic. Finally, the day of the event arrived. The park chosen for the Unity Day was decorated with colorful banners, flowers and balloons. People began to gather and the atmosphere was filled with anticipation. Everyone looked joyful and ready to demonstrate their commitment to peace and unity. But soon Michael noticed that the situation was becoming tense. Some of the opponents showed up at the event, their faces filled with hatred. They held signs with offensive slogans and began shouting loudly, trying to provoke the participants. "We will not respond to provocations," Michael whispered to Laura as they stood on the stage. "Our job is to keep this event peaceful." He knew it was up to them to decide how the day would go. The event began with speeches. Michael was the first to take the stage. "We are here today to celebrate our unity, our strength, and our determination to fight for justice," he began, and the crowd responded with applause. He felt their support growing. Other activists then took to the stage, sharing their stories and experiences. They spoke of hope, of change, and of the importance of continuing the fight for equality. The crowd cheered on each speaker, and even among those who were against it, doubts began to brew. However, at one point, one of the groups of opponents began throwing rocks and bottles at the activists. This caused panic among some participants. "We can't let them break our spirit," Michael shouted, and his words helped people gather together. "Remember why we are here," he continued. "We did not come with hate, but with love. Let's show that we are stronger." The crowd began singing a song about peace, and this helped to distract attention from the violence. But the situation did not stop. The opponents continued to provoke, and soon the smell of anger and fear was in the air. It became a critical moment when Michael saw that one of the activists was surrounded by aggressive opponents. He could not stay away. Gathering his courage, he decided to intervene. "Hey, leave him alone," he shouted, heading towards the group. But before he could reach his comrade, the police intervened, separating the crowds. Michael sensed that this could end badly, and he took action. "We are here to show our love and unity," he continued, trying to calm the situation. "We will not respond with hate." This caused many of those present to stop and reflect on their actions. Gradually, the standoff began to die down, and the police took control of the situation. "We will continue to fight peacefully, even if it is difficult," he repeated, and the activists began to support his slogans. This helped maintain a peaceful mood. Despite all the obstacles, Unity Day ended with a successful performance. People stayed in the square, talking, sharing stories, and supporting each other. They understood that this event was an important step forward, even if the confrontation did not stop. Later, when the activists gathered together, they felt stronger and more united. "We got through this together," Michael said, looking at his comrades. "It just confirms that our fight is important and that we must continue." In these moments, they realized that they were not alone, and that together they could overcome any challenge. This was a turning point in their movement, and they knew that there was still much work ahead, but now they felt ready for it.